Thanks for joining us. Nice to see you all for tonight's discussion of Gaslight from 1944. If you watched the British version from 4 years earlier, Lisa can talk a little bit and will talk a little bit about the differences, but you might be at a bit of a loss as to what we're talking about, which is why we tried to make it clear it was 1944 everywhere we put it, but it's rare that you have two movies that are widely available with the same title only 4 years apart. How are you tonight, Lisa?
I'm doing very well, Andrew. How are you?
I'm well, and thank you for joining us. Again, 2 weeks in a row, and we're really, I can say I'm very glad that you're here to join us for this movie because this is a wonderful movie. But before we get into that, a little bit of housekeeping. Please keep your audio on mute unless I call upon you to make your comment or ask your question. I will call on you because you will have raised your hand. As you can see on your screen using the raise hand function that has the little 2 above it, that I will call people as they appear with their raised hands. At that point, please ask your question or make your comment, and then please lower your hand and remute yourself to hear the response and whatever else comes across the airwaves, so to speak. We are very glad that these online forums have, among other things, had the benefit of bringing in people from outside of the greater Philadelphia area. If you are one of those people, please introduce yourself in the chat. And if people want to have discussions, sort of side discussions amongst themselves, please use the chat for that as well. And if you are from somewhere really far away, or you also want to let us know how we're doing or how you found BMFI, please visit the Where in the World section of brynmarfilm.org. You can find that in the Film Studies Online section. And that would be, we would really love to hear from you. And we'd love to know where people are checking in from. That would be great. That being said, I think we are just about ready to get to the discussion. I will say that I feel, unlike, as is not usually the case in most weeks, I do want to mention that I can imagine some of you are thinking that it would be a good idea to talk about in some way that we won't get too specific in mentioning that. Isn't it clever that Andrew and Lisa chose to schedule Gaslight the night before the election because this candidate's been gaslighting America or that person's been gaslighting America? And let me just say 2 things. First and foremost, this hour and a half every week is meant to be a reprieve from work and real world issues, and that includes politics. We're here to talk about movies, and we can have disagreements, and the movies touch on serious themes sometimes, but it's about the movies. The second thing I would say is if you're here tonight, you've watched the film, and you know from the film that gaslighting is a gradual and subtle process. And say what you will or think what you will about anybody involved in the election tomorrow, but I don't think, no matter how you look at it, that subtle and gradual applies. So it doesn't really connect to the film. So let's just go on from there and talk about the movie. And with that, I see we have one of our regulars first up out of the gate. David, how are you?
I'm great, Andrew. And Lisa, thank you for the selection. I have been accused on and off over my life of gaslighting people, and I always knew what it meant, but believe it or not, I had never seen the film. And it was just a fun watch looking at the characters. I thought that there was a little bit of development that was, I don't want to say missing, but there were some parts where I thought maybe if there was more time, they could have developed things a little better. I did want to just make a comment for you to comment, Lisa. The missing glove, when that was coming about, I kept thinking of the Cinderella glass slipper. And any thoughts you have? And having grown up in the watch and jewelry business, I thought that the holes were just a little bit loose to be able to pop them off so easily. And the last comment, is when she did her soliloquy in the attic about the knife, and the knife was there and the knife wasn't there. I said to Janice, wow, she just did Kate Hepburn. It just sounded so much like her. Thanks again for the selection. And now you can use this to tee off any direction you like.
Well, thank you, David, as always, for your comments. Lisa, do you want to start us off with anything that comes to mind based on what David was saying?
Sure. David, thank you for your comments. I'm actually kind of interested in perhaps you or others will touch on this in the discussion. I'm sort of interested in what parts you felt needed a little further development, because one thing that I really like about the 1944 version of Gaslight in comparison to the 1940 version, which I do understand some people saw, not everyone saw, but the 1940 version is, I mean, maybe it's a half an hour shorter in total. It's a very compact, lean experience with very little kind of expository or even development of characters. So I really think that the Cukor film does a great job of giving us almost this languid opening, maybe a 30-40 minute first act where we kind of establish the relationships, that the characters themselves, who these people are, what kind of motivates them, and then we really get into the meat of the gaslighting. But I will be curious to hear from you or anyone else what points you did think could be further developed, that would add a lot of additional resonance to the story. And I see a couple things popping up in the chat about some plot points that perhaps weren't super clear, or people wanted further explanation on that. If that's the issue, then we can have that conversation another time. But I will be very curious to hear if people think that the characters were not as emotionally fleshed out as they would have wanted, because I think that's a really strong point of this film. And I appreciate your comments on the jewels being too easy to take out of the costume. That's very amusing to share. Thank you, Andrew.
I thought that the person I wanted to see more from, and that I was more curious about her motivations, was the Angela Lansbury character. I have an idea that that the sort of standards, the censors of the time would not have allowed her motivations and her full expression of her feelings to be more thoroughly explored in the film. I think that to me, it seemed she had designs on Charles Boyer, and they were not designs of a above board nature, so to speak. So I think the film did a good job of suggesting that, but I also went back and forth on whether she was in on it with him or not. And in some ways, a lack of clarity on that point isn't a big deal, but I wouldn't have minded knowing and seeing a bit more of her. But I guess the fact that I feel that way is part of the reason why she was nominated for a supporting Oscar, given the relatively small size of her role. So let's see, Joss, you have a question or comment?
Oh, so much to say. Just one quick one. As we were watching this, my wife and I said, how did they get past the Hayes office with the excursion to somewhere where they were sharing a room, and it was remedied later on by an aside that they had been married there somewhere in Italy. It was just an interesting observation. Okay, that's not a big deal. It was just funny. I was also struck by the visual style that evoked, certainly as Lisa had said in her introductory video, the film noir qualities of darkness and shadows and all of that. But I was also struck by Foggy London, which reminded me in some ways of film, at least one film version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And the other thing that I was curious about, and if anyone has any comments, was the body of work of George Cukor, the director. I mean, as Lisa mentioned in her introduction, he was known as a director of great women's roles, and that I think is certainly true. But he also concentrated on comedies and literary adaptations, and at least one great musical, My Fair Lady. And this one was somewhat out of character for him, as in his darkness and its mystery. Just wonder if you had any thoughts about any of that.
Well, thanks very much, Joss. I enjoyed the atmosphere created by the fog and the use of fog in the film. And it's, of course, when you're talking about London and murder, the fog sort of is contractually obligated to appear, I think. And it certainly does in a number of films throughout. Certainly classic Hollywood and even some more recent versions of the Jack the Ripper story and things like that. Regarding Cukor, I sort of see your point that this is a bit of a darker film than what we tend to think of him as making, but what I tend to associate him with is strong female characters and female characters that drive the story. And in that regard, I think the film fits right into his oeuvre. But Lisa, you might have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I agree entirely, Andrew. I do know that Cukor directed a couple other mystery films that would fit the Gaslight mold or would be analogous to Gaslight in terms of tone and content. But yes, I mean, overwhelmingly, when I think of Cukor, I think of Katharine Hepburn and I think of comedy, even though he, as you say, does have a pretty diverse body of work. But I love just seeing that character, the female character driving the story element that Andrew spoke about, and our total identification with the female perspective. And I think there's a distinction when you think about women's pictures in the 30s and 40s. There's the weepy, there's the martyred woman, and Cukor wasn't necessarily interested in the martyred woman. He was interested in a woman in transformation, in or kind of challenging gender roles. Katharine Hepburn is probably the Cukor female, and I think that Ingrid Bergman's character here fits the mold of what Cukor was examining in his many films with female roles.
Yeah, I mean, a number of his movies have women who are put in, to put it broadly, tough spots. And a lot of times they're put in the tough spots, the tough spot they're in is related to their being a woman, basically. Like here, it has to do with, Victorian England and marriage and what those sort of, dynamic of that is supposed to be. In other examples, it's a woman in the workplace or a workplace traditionally dominated by men, and how the woman, often Katharine Hepburn, either improves her situation or just outright gets the better of the men. So I think we can see how this fits in. And not all of his movies are sort of positive. I will say that not as many of them are, involve murder in the London fog and driving people insane. But I think it is sort of a piece. And sort of beyond that, genre wasn't, by and large, Cukor was an industry, a studio director in the 30s and 40s and 50s, and that's sort of what they did. There were exceptions, of course. Hitchcock did only what he was interested in, and John Ford did what he was interested in. But by and large, you'll find a wide variety of genres across most of the successful directors of that era, and I think Cukor, by and large, isn't an exception. Let's see, Robert, you have a question or comment?
Oh, yes, thanks. Given what the theme of this picture is about, psychological vulnerability and gaslighting, Lisa had said in her introduction that this was an example of film noir and female Gothic, which is related. And I believe she mentioned the chiaroscuro lighting, and then somebody mentioned the fog. And I'm wondering, this was not done on location, obviously, right? It was in the studio. So could you tell us how do you create chiaroscuro lighting when you're on set? And the other question is, how do you create fog like that?
Okay.
Thanks.
We can address those things, sure.
And just one other thing. And could you just address, it was nominated for an Oscar for Best Cinematography. What techniques do you think were remarkable in the cinematography in this film that helped to drive home the theme of the film?
Okay, thank you,
Thanks.
Robert. I would say, first of all, that I don't know the specific technique by which fog was created, but I would say that if it's available to, Ozzy Osbourne in the 1970s or AC/DC or Kiss, then I'm sure Hollywood was able to figure it out first. I would also say that my guess is the fog probably wasn't all that healthy for you, but I don't know the specific technique. I just know that there's lots of places where fog or smoke is successfully created. So it doesn't strike me as that particular. I think what is more particularly interesting, or more of an achievement, relates to your question, is how it is used on film, how it shows up on screen. And that is in part a function of the cinematography. As we all know from, driving a car on a foggy night, light and fog interact in sometimes very complex ways. And we want enough light to see, when we're driving a car, we obviously want to be able to see as far ahead of us as we can, but we have basically two settings. We have brights and not brights, but the cinematographer obviously is thinking about, what sort of distance, what sort of level of how much does the fog have to cloak a character, how far is a character supposed to be able to see, and how much light and where is that light to allow that to happen, to what extent, and then of course gradually changing or adjusting that light as the fog is sort of seen to clear, or the person or the place comes more into view. And I think that what Lisa actually said, I think it was a little different than what you said. I think she said this is a great example of a female Gothic, and that's sort of in a way, kind of a companion or a mirror genre to film noir, which I thought was a great insight in her introduction. And I think one thing they both have in common is something you mentioned, which is chiaroscuro, which is the presence of bright, well-lit areas and very dark, almost impenetrable areas within the same frame, within the same image. And the presence of that where it seems at place in the setting, and the presence of that where it seems at place in the setting and is used successfully to reinforce elements of character or the tone of the scene are the sorts of reasons why a cinematographer would be recognized for his or her work. Lisa, would you like to comment on any of those topics, or perhaps on the genre comparison that I thought was just a brilliant insight?
Well, thank you. I'll quickly say it wasn't entirely mine. That there's been a critic, I believe the critic's name is Emmanuel Levy, who's written about the female Gothic and film noir as being part and parcel of the same movement, just seen through different gender lenses. But I think that there's a lot of mirroring going on. I mean, even the film noir setting is typically the urban landscape, and the female Gothic is the domesticity of the house. There are so many fun parallels that it almost seems like they were cut from the same cloth on purpose, but they just kind of sprung up out of the same anxiety-ridden well, I suppose. But in terms of cinematography, I'll just add a little bit more to that too. The film is a stage adaptation, and what really differentiates a cinematic experience from the theater stage is this cinematic space, and the ability to have such expressive movement, such metaphorical movement throughout this space. And the cinematography is just so good at aligning us even more with Paula. I mean, even from the very beginning, when she goes, or rather when the door opens to the house and the camera is pausing, like hesitant to go into the house and look around. I mean, the camera is so aligned with Paula's senses, and with our senses as viewers, we're kind of exploring the house for the first time in 10 years since she's been in there with her. It's just such a magnificent example in a film full of them of why cinema wins out over theater for me every time, because it's the cinematography is so subtle most of the time, but then it just breaks out in these incredible sequences, like when Paula is so driven by the sounds and the gaslight guttering, that she screams for Elizabeth Maid, in that scene where there are just these rushes of close-ups and jarring expanses of space when she's looking down the stairs. I cannot say enough about how great the cinematography is in this. So I'm glad that the cinematography went over well with you.
And actually, related to that, and a point that Robert asked about that I didn't address, the question of cinematography on location versus on a set. And the reason that Hollywood was filming on sets for so long, particularly in its first few decades, was because it's much easier to control the environment, and that includes the lighting. Those sets were on sound stages that had huge rigs, high above the floor, where lights could be put anywhere and they could be moved in any direction. And while it may seem like it would be easier to create that atmosphere on location, it might be easier to create that atmosphere on location, but it wouldn't be easier to get precisely the look that they want on film on location, particularly not in the 1940s. Technology has changed. Now they're using digital technology. When they were using film got faster, which meant that it reacted more quickly when it was exposed, and it required less light, so it could pick up darker images and more subtlety. So they really that was really one of the reasons why they shot on location, on a set, and why, to some extent, far more recent productions than you might think do that as well, because they can control the environment and get the lighting exactly as they want. And in many cases that creates, even though it's counterintuitive, that can create a more sort of authentic or richer atmosphere than shooting in the actual place. Let's see, Barbara and Richard, you have questions or comments?
Yes. First of all, thank you for selecting this movie. It's such a fabulous film, such an effective movie. And I have two questions. The first is that, and I remember thinking this years ago when I last saw it, the film appeared to me like it could have been directed by Alfred Hitchcock. The mood, the psychological suspense, the study of human behavior. And I'm wondering if Cukor and Hitchcock had any kind of relationship or influence on each other's work. So that was the first question. The second, very different. This film provided a very graphic depiction of an abusive relationship, especially the social isolation that caused Paula to question her own judgment and then having to rely solely on her abusive husband to understand her reality. And I'm wondering if this was recognized and named as abuse at the time the movie came out, and how audiences responded to this dimension of the film.
Well, thank you for those questions, Barbara. To your first point, and Lisa mentioned this in her introduction, Hitchcock had made Rebecca that came out in 1940, and Suspicion, which came out in 1941, which, even though Suspicion is not, in terms of its look or setting, as nearly as much of a female Gothic as Rebecca is, it is another, is this woman married to a murderer type of movie. And I don't know of Cukor and Hitchcock having any particular relationship or connection. I think of Cukor as an MGM director, and Hitchcock was never under contract at MGM, as far as I know, certainly not in the 40s. So if anything, I think it's entirely possible that Cukor had seen Rebecca and Suspicion and was perhaps, motivated, inspired, etc. By those. Regarding the second point, I don't think that, I haven't read contemporaneous reviews, but I would be very surprised if that behavior was identified as sort of abuse full stop. I could imagine terms like cruelty and things like that, but the sort of threshold for all sorts of things back then, in terms of where it went from being, where it crossed the line into being undeniably identifiable as something as concrete as abuse, those thresholds were higher then, by and large, than they are today. I'm not saying that was right, but that was typically the case. So I would be surprised if it was identified as such, but I mean, make no mistake, the film depicts the Charles Boyer character as a villain, and even if it's not named as such, he is doing bad things, and he is punished, at least as far as the movie goes. Lisa.
I don't know why Hitchcock cast Ingrid Bergman in a couple movies that came post Gaslight. I have wondered if it was because of the performance in Gaslight, which was so good. I don't know if that's ever been explicitly stated anywhere why he did cast Ingrid Bergman, but yes, I do agree that this is a very Hitchcockian film. And I also agree with Andrew that Cukor may or may not have been influenced by Rebecca and Suspicion, and a couple other films that had already started coming out in this kind of female Gothic or menaced wife little subgenre going on. And in terms of how audiences at the time responded to this as quote unquote spousal abuse, I'm not sure about that either. I don't know when spousal abuse kind of entered the cultural lexicon, including emotional and psychological abuse. But I mean, this did popularize the term gaslighting. And from what I've read, the term gaslighting to indicate this sort of manipulation was used in the 1940s. You know, the initial play came out in 1938, and so that there was this kind of concentrated dose of both the play success and the film success in the United States. So it was a phrase that was used in the 40s. So I don't know how deep contemporary audiences seeing Gaslight in 1944 took the idea of abuse, but like Andrew said, it was not good. no one was coming away thinking that this is how you should act with your spouse, I would like to think.
You know, Lisa, I'm so glad you mentioned Bergman being in Hitchcock films after this one, because you reminded me that when I was watching Gaslight again for tonight, I thought it was how interesting it was that just 2 years later she would be in Notorious, whereas a number of people have mentioned in the chat, Joss and Richard and others have mentioned, she is a woman put in a position that of a marriage that she should not be in, that is not healthy for her to be in, who is put through, you know, what would certainly today be considered abuse by a person who ostensibly cares for her. It's a great movie, and I don't want to say anymore because I don't want to ruin anything. But one does have to wonder if, you know, maybe Hitchcock saw this and thought, I mean, he always liked working with big stars, and this movie obviously helped Bergman become a bigger star in Hollywood. But I think that's a great point, that maybe Hitchcock saw this and said, that might be a good fit. So that's interesting. Josie and Fred, question or comment? Josie and Fred, are you there? Okay, then we can come back to you, try again. We will go to Joan. Joan, are you there? Hi, Joan. Joan,
Yes,
go ahead.
Joan. I enjoyed the movie very much, and I wanted to say that I wanted to read more interesting things about it. So I read that the part that Ingrid Bergman played was originally supposed to be done by Irene Dunne, but they sold the rights to MGM, and then Hedy Lamarr was asked to do it, but she turned it down, and that's how Ingrid Bergman got the role. And I also read that Ingrid Bergman was reluctant to do the role because it was a leading role, and she was a strong, independent woman, and she didn't think she could play a fragile, timid lady. And she said it was the best challenge that she ever had in her career that far.
Well, thank you very much for sharing that, Joan. I don't have anything to add, but it's good to have that bit of additional insight. Thank you.
Okay.
Ken, you have a question or comment?
Okay. I have to say, I really enjoyed this movie as much as any of the ones we've seen. You know, you're used to hearing me complain about cars that drive backwards and Richard Gere wearing hairstyles that are 80 years too soon. I love the cinematography in this. I love the way they set up the square in London and how they made it so realistic. I love the outfits that they wore, that they always looked freshly pressed. And this is the way a certain class of Englishmen, I guess, walked around. And I even love the setup where they went to the concert, even though it was not a real long scene. But I love the way that was set up too. And each of these, to me, had their own part in the movie. Not to mention the Joseph Cotton character. I just love the way they all got incorporated into it. What I think differs this, there have been some movies in recent years, I think with Jennifer Lopez and Julia Roberts, where they played women who were mentally abused like this by the spouses that had to do with just the personalities, the pathologic personalities. This I thought was a little different because the way Charles Boyer acted was kind of a means to an end. His reason wasn't just his personality, it was because he wanted to get her put away so that he could take over her residence and sneak away with these jewels.
Yeah, yeah. It's greed, in addition to obviously not having a tremendous amount of respect for other human beings, including women. But you're right. You're thinking of two of my wife's favorite movies, the Julia Roberts movie from the 90s, Sleeping with the Enemy, and the Jennifer Lopez movie, Enough, where they marry men who were just horrible abusers and have a really warped idea of what a marriage should be, and don't have the additional mercenary component to it. In that sense, that makes this the diehard of the spousal abuse subgenre, because they're not just terrorists, they're terrorists who are there for money. So in that sense, it does set the film apart. But I also think that obviously, he had to have been comfortable. I don't necessarily know that we should say he relished in it, but he was certainly comfortable with that sort of behavior.
Oh,
but
I think he was very comfortable doing that.
Yes.
But as I said, there was a purpose behind it.
Yes, and that is different than is often the case. Certainly different than those earlier Hitchcock films we mentioned, and I think it does add an interesting component. I agree. Thank you.
Thanks.
Lisa, did you have any thoughts on that point?
I would go even further than saying he's comfortable doing it. I do think that he enjoys gaslighting Paula. I think he enjoys exerting control over women. And we see this in his different power plays with the different women throughout the film. But I do think a case can be made for him enjoying his psychological torture of Paula and these other women. I think of that scene where he makes the maids kiss the Bible, and that is perverse. Like that is bordering on some sort of perverse fetishism. Like, and there are moments in the film where, for example, when Charles Boyer is, thinking quick because Paula has taken it upon herself to try to show a glimmer of the strong, independent woman that she once was, and go to this party, go to this concert. And he tries to, manipulate her out of it, and that's not going to work. And when he's getting dressed, you can tell that he's a little flustered. And this look comes over his face when he realizes what he's going to do. That is just, it almost equals the glint in his eyes when he sees the jewels in the Tower of London. Like he does enjoy the control he has. And I really think that it's such a rich film when you think about the gender politics on display. I think it comes back to the idea that, while this is a jewel motivated film from his perspective, he couldn't control the aunt, this strong woman who was the internationally renowned opera singer, who was the mistress of czars, or just this international strong female character that is a specter in most of the film. He couldn't control her, and so he's in a way getting perverse revenge on not being able to control that woman except through killing her, by exerting his torture on Paula. So.
I think you're right. The more I think back on it, he's clearly compensating for or avenging his own insecurities and inadequacies. I mean, the way he has a tantrum when they're first in the house and Ingrid Bergman discovers that letter that we later sort of figure out that he's the one who wrote it, and he almost sort of has a tantrum about it. That he feels inferior, and there are, judging by how, based on the sort of the way men in Hollywood movies in the 40s were kind of assessed or defined, he should feel inadequate, right? I mean, he's not the primary source of their income. I think her family wealth is. He is sort of, doing his composing and taking the sort of, he's not trying to improve himself the way she was for years with her voice lessons. He's really not, in the sort of traditional Hollywood sense, a very masculine man. And I think you're right that he compensates for that and takes pleasure in compensating for that in the cruelty. I think you're right about that. Dana, you have a question or comment?
I do. So thank you, Lisa, so much for mentioning about the 1940 movie, because I watched them both, and I don't know if other people did, but I just want to say that you really, really, really can appreciate this movie even more when you see the movie from 1940, which is not to say that there aren't some things in the 1940 movie that I actually liked better, because there's some really great things in that movie. But some of the differences really make you appreciate, first, George Cukor, because the women absolutely come alive in this movie. Ingrid Bergman has it all over the woman whose name is Diana Weinerd in the first one. And so the women are just much better crafted, much better created. The other thing about this movie, as opposed to the 40s movie, is you can see how Hollywood spends money, because the dressing of the set is so much, it's the same basic house. I mean, with the flight of stairs in the same spot and so forth. But the dressing of the set is so much more sophisticated and beautiful. The moment when she pulls the picture out that he's taken off the wall and hidden, and it's been in the same spot. It's the exact same moment in both movies, but in the George Cukor movie, it's just so extravagant. So that's really cool. Another thing, though, that was really fascinating to me is, this is, of course, Ingrid Bergman's movie. The first one, though, is not. I felt that the first one belonged to the villain. And I just want to mention, for anybody who's interested, the villain was played in the first one, the 1940 movie, by an actor by the name of Anton Walbrook. And I recognized him immediately because he was the horrible, horrible Lermontov in The Red Shoes, who I thought was one of the most villainous people ever. And he totally worked. He was misogynistic, he was crueler, and it was really his movie. So I just really got a kick out of comparing the two. And if people, want to take another step, and if you're bored watching whatever you might be watching tomorrow during the day or tomorrow night, I don't know what could be, because I'm not allowed to say, but and you want to watch another movie, I really recommend watching the 1940 movie. I want to say one more thing, and that's about Angela Lansbury. She kind of got gypped because the Nancy character in the first movie actually did have a dalliance with him, and they went to a dance hall. They had a date in a dance hall, which was a very cool scene, very British. And I was wondering, I thought it was interesting that Angela Lansbury had less to do in our movie, and yet she made such an important, part. She was so important. The other thing about Angela, and I'll go, is you can really see in her performance in this movie where she's going to go. That sort of sassy, low life character was often part of the character she played on stage and on screen. And you can see where it all started when she was 18 years old. You could really see that she was going to be great. But anyway, so I really recommend people watching the 1940 movie. It was really a treat. So that's it for me.
Thanks, Dana. Yeah, I mean, I have to say that I think that the fact that that Lansbury was able to convey how she felt about her two bosses in the movie, and for that matter, how she felt about the cook, without much dialogue to those effects, was impressive in retrospect, even though it doesn't sort of seem like she has a lot happening or a lot to do in the movie. Lisa, did you have any thoughts on Dana's comments?
Dana, you gave a great rundown of a lot of the similarities and differences between the two. I'm so glad you were able to catch the 1940 version too. And I know that at least a couple more people did, especially from what I've seen popping off in the chat. Yes, they are very different in terms of the visual look, although I love the 1940 opening titles with the gaslight. Which is very striking, but I think you identified the real reason, the real difference between the two, and the real reason that I prefer the 1944 version. The 1940 version is Anton Walbrook's movie. He is so monstrous and sleazy and over the top. It is quite the performance, and you can't really look away from him. But Diana Wynyard is, she's almost, and I mean this as a pro for the film, she's sort of a pedestrian woman that is then torn to absolute shreds by the psychological torture of her husband. But to me, the 1944 version exceeds in its female representation, because we really have a strong, robust, independent woman who is looking into her own career and has a love of art and connections to the outer world. And you do not get that in the Diana Wynyard character in the 1940 version, which makes it, on one hand, probably very realistic for women watching the film in 1940 and now, that this doesn't just happen to Ingrid Bergman. Like it happens to everyone, or it can happen to everyone. So on one hand, I think that's a pro in the 1940 film camp, that it has this female character that isn't a glamorous movie star who we all know and love, Ingrid Bergman, but it makes the film a little less enjoyable to watch because it is even crueler. And also the Kukor version is fully aligned with Paula, and I think I've said this a couple times. In the 1940 version, you the viewer, you see Anton Walbrook put a brooch or put something in a bag. You see what he is doing. Whereas in 1944's Gaslight, we, the viewer, are just as confounded as Ingrid Bergman when the watch turns up in Gregory's watch turns up in her bag. And so I think that's a real plus for the 1944 film in terms of viewer identification. And someone had brought up Hitchcock before. I almost wonder what Hitchcock would have done, because Hitchcock loves giving the audience more information than the characters. But here in Kukor's version, we don't have any additional information in those intimate settings. Certainly we have, the Scotland Yard interludes, we learn about the jewels. Paula doesn't know about the jewels, but when it comes to the real intimacy of what Gregory is doing, or what the husband character is doing to the wife, I think the 1944 version really wins out. But I highly recommend everyone watching both.
Arlene, you have a question or comment?
Yes. First of all, I don't think you could have picked a better time to show a picture about gaslighting. Unfortunately, we are all being gaslighted right now.
Okay. Let's talk about the movie.
Okay, but do vote.
Is that it?
No, it's
Oh,
not
okay.
quite it. I have seen 44 version very often. Last night I did watch the 1941 in addition, which was the first time that I saw it. And I entirely agree that I enjoyed the 44 much more. But I particularly love Joseph Cotton's role in the 44, which made a much more, I guess, hero kind of thing out of the police force. But in both of the films, they did have that scene where she confronted her husband and said, "Is this a knife I am holding? This can't really be a knife," to prove that she was finished taking it.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Arlene. Let's see. Yvonne, do you have a question or comment?
Okay, yes, I do. Actually, when they were talking about Ingrid Bergman, I think it was Joan, I don't remember your name, I'm sorry, it's been a lot of people since she mentioned this, but she had mentioned how Ingrid Bergman didn't want to do the role and it was very challenging for her. I remember when I was watching TCM, they had mentioned Gaslight, and they mentioned that Ingrid Bergman, to get an idea of mental illness, she actually went to a hospital and was looking at people that had mental illness just to get an idea of Paula losing her mind. And I think it was fantastic that she did that. I mean, it was so weird because I guess that's kind of like method acting, but it was fantastic because it made you feel like you're actually there losing your mind with her. And everything, her subtle movements, everything was just so amazing. And again, that's why I think you're right when they said this was definitely Ingrid Bergman's film, because when you look at it, why would they cast this woman from Sweden who's not even English, because supposedly it's supposed to be a British girl, but then you don't care because her performance is so fantastic that you're just like, I get it. I get why they picked her. But, that's just my comment on that.
Well, thank you, Yvonne. Yeah, method acting, a method actor would have gone even further and probably would have, gotten themselves admitted to an institution for a 48-hour hold or something if they were really a method actor. But Bergman, rather than imagining, which is what a lot of her peer actors would have done, rather than imagining what someone going with that sort of mental illness would be like, she went to observe it. And that is to her credit, because that would not have been common practice at that time. And she knew, she was smart enough of an actor to know that she was going to have the challenge of depicting, communicating to the audience, showing the viewers what the inner turmoil, and it was the inner turmoil of that character, was like. And how do you convey that in a visual medium like film, and how do you sort of transmit that through the screen? And that's a challenge. Making things that are internal external is always a challenge to be done in cinema, convincingly and credibly. And I think she does it, and it probably all started with those visits. Lisa, did you have anything to add?
I read the same, and it really shows in her eyes and her movements what I would imagine someone to be losing their mind looks like. It is very effective, to the point that this is more of a horror film than most horror films to me, because of how well we are identified with her psychological breakdown.
Lee, you have a question or comment? Lee Reich, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi.
It's going back in the discussion a little bit, but to the comparison between the 40 movie and the 44 movie, I thought that it was a better characterization of the Charles Boyer character for him not to go to the pool hall with her. He obviously flirts with her. He is not above leading her on a little bit, but it makes him much more of a psychological villain rather than, I mean, if it would change his character if he actually went to the pool hall with her. And I think it was makes him more of a concentrated psychological abuser to have changed that piece for this particular film.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And there's something about his, to my mind, there's something about his comfort in talking to her, even though it's just talk, as far as we know, talking to Angela Lansbury the way he does in front of Ingrid Bergman. That's kind of a different type of maliciousness than, or malice than sneaking around and not talking like that.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Lisa, did you have any thoughts on that?
I really think that the casting of Charles Boyer in this role was just as superb as casting Ingrid Bergman, because Andrew, you mentioned earlier that he wasn't hyper masculine, and I think that kind of prettiness and almost effeteness to Charles Boyer's character is really interesting in this film, especially compared to Ingrid Bergman, who, you know, was taller than Charles Boyer. And I mean, everyone seems to describe her as robust. Everyone loves using the word robust for Ingrid Bergman, but she's such a, I don't want to go so far as to say embodies traditional masculine characteristics, but there is this real flexibility with traditional gender traits and expectations with the two that I think plays around with the sexuality too in some really interesting ways. I mean, it's almost too easy to say that Charles Boyer is obsessed with, you know, the royal family jewels. I don't think it goes as easy as that. I think that, you know, Charles Boyer at the time was known as this very you know, sexual Lothario. You know, he was cast in leads, you know, romantic leads. He was, I mean, Ingrid Bergman was excited to work with him because she thought he was attractive, you know, or had a crush on him, I suppose. So to cast Charles Boyer in this role is so interesting. It's kind of a twist on you know, roles that we've seen throughout the 40s where there's, or even into the 50s, where there's this you know, kind of psychopathic man who's asexual but is interested in shaping a woman into like his plaything, like Laura, for example. I think that's such an interesting kind of twist on that, where he isn't necessarily demonstrating enough sexual interest in women. Nancy, for example, he flirts with her, but he's not going to go to the dance hall with her. So it's an interesting casting, because this is a man who audiences would see as a sexual, you know, virile male in Hollywood at the time, but yet he's playing someone who is not pursuing sexual relations with women after that first initial, you know, pre-honeymoon scene, where Paula, it's quite, I think someone said they were surprised it got past censors. It's quite sensual. I mean, Paula is tousled in bed. Clearly they've shared the same bed. And then he kind of systematically takes that physicality away from their relationship, and then causes this divide between the Nancy character and Paula by showing Nancy more sexual attention and just denying that to Paula. So it's just a fascinating bit of casting that I think is worthy of a little extra attention than most.
Richard, do you have a question or comment?
Yes.
Which Richard, Andrew?
Yes.
I'm sorry, Richard Chaitt.
Okay, yeah. The thing that I can't answer is, why would Charles Boyer drive his wife crazy when by marrying her, he shares everything in the house And it was a fortune. He doesn't need any more than that. It's not like he needed money. I think it was to get back at the niece because her aunt would not give him the time of day.
I think that's a really interesting perspective. I would say that in my experience, most, at least in the movies, most criminals who are out for money aren't familiar with the concept of half of a lot is enough. But I think you make a very good point. I think that explains why we get a sense of their history, of his history with the aunt, and why he chose her specifically. I really think that's a very good point. Lisa, do you think there's something to that as well?
It's an interesting perspective. I think the movie wants us to believe that he is animated exclusively by these jewels, which it's kind of a weird motivating factor for me in 2020 to latch onto, I suppose. But I think the movie is trying to make that a part of his real motivations here. But I also think that what you're saying is an element of it too.
Mark, you have a question or comment?
Both Janet and I have comments. I'll go. I think there's also an element of revenge. The girl interrupted the burglary and prevented him from getting the jewels originally. So I think that he's angry about that, and so part of it is acting out on that anger.
I think that's a good point. Yeah, absolutely. There's a reason there's that whole history, and I think that certainly must play into it. You all had another question or comment?
Yeah, just a comment. I wanted to say that watching somebody emotionally abuse someone else was so incredibly uncomfortable for me that I had to turn it off last night and go to bed, and saw the rest of it today when it was light out. Like, I could have watched The Godfather 10 times over and watched them shooting people with fake bullets.
I think that certainly must play into it.
Before I could watch this again. Like, it was wonderful. It was amazing. I realized it was a hole in my, understanding of film. I knew that it was a famous movie I hadn't seen, but it was terrifying to me.
Well, on the one hand, I'm sorry for your discomfort. On the other hand, I think that suggests that it was a very well made and very effective film. And it is interesting how different things affect us differently, and how, in some sense, the sort of to use your point, the gore of The Godfather is in some ways something we can more easily detach ourselves from, because we can sort of more easily see how that is, mechanical and a process and created, where the actions and behaviors and reactions of characters, if the film is doing its job, we forget that too is, for lack of a better term, a put on. And I think it speaks a lot that a film from 76 years ago, had that effect. I think that says a lot. Both about the film's quality as it was made, but also your engagement as a viewer. Lisa, did you have a thought to add?
Yeah, as I said earlier, this is more of a horror film than most horror films to me. I almost put a trigger warning in my intro, because I imagine that if anyone has been in an emotionally or psychologically abusive relationship, watching this is hard. PSTD even inducing perhaps, but Andrew said it's over 75 years old, and yet it still endures. It's just one of the most brilliant examinations of the psychological damage people can inflict on each other, and I think that's why it still endures today.
Richard Hirsh.
Thanks, Andrew. It's just a quick comment. I don't think it's been touched on. In both versions, and I apologize to the people who didn't see 1940, we've all referred to it so much tonight. In both versions, the threat of bringing in a doctor, not just one doctor, but two doctors. I just wonder if you and Lisa might comment on that, because Andrew, you and some of the other instructors, and Lisa might have been one of them, I apologize if I don't remember, have commented on the 1950s Hitchcock type movies where psychoanalysis or psychiatry was now, considered acceptable. But here it's this threat that's held like anything but the doctors, because it's obviously tied to incarceration in an institution. And Barbara thinks she recalls, and she's probably right, the irony that Ingrid Bergman later plays a psychoanalyst, I believe in Spellbound.
Yeah.
With Gregory Peck. So just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role of psychiatry, psychoanalysis, psychiatry doctors in this movie. Seems not to have turned the corner yet.
Yeah, that's a great comment. I will say that it's the next year that she plays one in Spellbound, actually, for Hitchcock. I think that I might not have been exactly clear. I think that psychoanalysis, one of the reasons Spellbound gets made is because producer David O. Selznick was a big proponent, and a big early proponent in Hollywood and in America, for that matter, for Freudian psychoanalysis. So it kind of starts there to enter Hollywood sort of popular vernacular, and goes on for decades, to the point where in 1960, many of us are frustrated by the sort of pop psychological jargon-laden conclusion of Psycho. But I think this is a bit of a different dynamic, what you're referring to, because from well before the popularity of psychoanalysis in American popular culture and continuing well past it, there is the sad history in the real world, but also in Hollywood movies, of the sort of use of medical authority to control women. And that is a kind of sub-genre of the woman's film of the 40s and 50s. Joan, God almighty.
Fontaine?
No. Who played Mildred Pierce?
Crawford.
Oh, thank you. Good
Crawford.
Lord. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm embarrassed. Joan Crawford, in a movie called Possessed, is basically a woman who only sort of gets better, and by basically sort of being, forced to kind of recount her whole life to this doctor in some asylum. And so there's that element of it, and that the threat of bringing in the doctors who would have this sort of unimpeachable authority to have her committed, or to suggest any other behaviors or treatments that her husband would be duty bound to follow, would be a real sort of credible and menacing threat to a woman, to a female character, particularly in the era in which the story is set, but even in the era in which the film is made. I mean, I'm sure many of us watch Mad Men and remember that early on in that, January Jones, Betty gets sent to, or goes to, a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist has calls and updates with Dawn, with her husband, and discusses her sessions with her husband. And that wasn't, to my recollection, shown as anything extraordinary in that period. So that there's a long history of that, and that sort of medicalization of sort of women's behavior or femaleness was an undercurrent in a number of Hollywood films throughout those decades, and unfortunately, I think with some basis outside of movies. Lisa, anything to add?
That was a perfect answer. Nothing to add.
Oh, gee, thank you. That makes up for my forgetting Joan Crawford's last name. Another comment from another Joan Strank. Do you have another comment or question? Okay. Dana, did you have another comment or question?
I was on. What happened?
Oh, Joan. Okay, Joan, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Am I on?
That's all right. Yes.
Okay. I read that in the Joseph Cotton role, in the short story, it was originally about a stodgy old elderly man. In order to make it more appealing, they got Joseph Cotton to play the role to make him look, like a point of interest in the movie. And I also read that Ingrid Bergman and Charles Boyer were the same height. So he had to stand on a box to make him look taller. And he wore 2-inch heels, but she kept kicking the box in that scene in the railway station. So they had to shoot it a few times. And that Angela Lansbury wore platform shoes to make her more sinister and domineering because she was a shorter person. That's
Okay.
all I have.
Thanks, Joan.
Okay.
I think it would have been very appropriate for his. I mean, he should have been a shorter character. It just would have sort of played into, you know, his motivations for being so cruel to her and having such being so defensive. Dana, did you have another comment or question?
Yep, it's time for a dumb question. Here's my dumb question. We know what gaslighting means, right? We do, of course. But I'm not sure I know whether the literal gaslighting in this movie, the fact that the gas goes down when he goes upstairs and it goes back up right before he's coming downstairs, is meant to be part of the gaslighting project. In other words, I guess what I'm saying is it's called gaslight, but is that part of what he's doing on purpose, or is it the other stuff that he's doing on purpose, you know, when he hides things? I mean, he's got to go up there. He needs the gas to see. So it's
right.
Right. So
no, it's not a dumb question. It's a good question. And the question is the behavior, is the treatment called gaslighting because of the movie called Gaslight and what happens in the movie as a whole, or is it because of literally the dimming of the gas lights within the movie? And I think it's the former. I think it's the former, because you're absolutely right. Nobody is dimming the lights with the express purpose of driving her insane. The lights are dimming and nobody knows why, and that is doing it, but the lights are dimming because he is turning them on elsewhere in the building where nobody knows there is another person turning on lights.
I think that it probably exists as the term because it's such a rich metaphor for someone's life essence being dimmed. Like, no, I do not think that Charles Boyer's character even maybe recognized that if he turned on the gas upstairs, then Paula would see the gas. I mean, I do think that he specifically hired a deaf or hard of hearing maid so that when he's clomping around, she would not be able to say, oh yes, someone is upstairs in the attic. But I don't, that's actually a great question, as Andrew said. I do not think that it is part of his scheme, but I do think that it exists outside of the movie because, well, I mean, the title, Gaslight, of course, but it really is just such a great visual for how Paula is feeling in that moment. I mean, her entire being just, it is guttering and you know, disappearing. So that's my comment on why gaslighting is the term. I don't know what the term would be if we were more literal about it, but I think metaphorically it's the best term to take away from this movie.
Agreed. Marilyn, do you have a question or comment?
Oh, yeah. Hi, Andrew. I'm really glad that you had this talk tonight, because I happened to catch the movie on television a couple of weeks ago, and I had just experienced someone gaslighting me that I've known a long time, but it got really bad, and I didn't know that's what it was called because I'd forgotten about the movie. I'm probably the oldest person in the room because I was born 10 years before this movie was even made. And for them to put the spotlight on this kind of behavior, because I'm just going to present my own personal experience as a suburban housewife. When we didn't have it so much in my home, but I had many friends who, because of the families they were raised in, were taught to obey their husbands, and that included all kinds of abuse. You were just supposed to suck it up. That was your destiny. And divorce was absolutely, you know, a 4-letter word. And it wasn't until after the women's movement that, I mean, if a woman was really aggressive or assertive, she was called mannish or bossy or a bitch. And it's after the women's movement, after the dust had settled in the suburban wives, like the Stepford wives, that women began to realize that it was permissible for them to say no and to stand up for themselves. And the only abuse that was considered during the middle part of the 20th century was physical abuse. And that was slowly coming around. People didn't think that they thought it was a man's right to beat his wife. And the emotional abuse is in my memory, is a real newcomer on the stage. So the fact that he was able to capture this phenomenon and portray it as being so horrible in the time that it was made was absolutely. I wish I had the words to explain it. Does everybody understand what I'm trying to say?
No, we understand. You're talking about the depiction, the effective and convincing and potent depiction of a behavior that and depicting it as bad and problematic and cruel and all of those things at a time when that was not widely thought of as an element of inappropriate behavior.
That's right. Yeah.
Yes, no, we understand, and thank you very much for making that comment. And I think that it's a wonderful sort of summation note for this discussion, because it just further communicates the effectiveness of the film and how it really fits in line with Cukor's sort of larger career. I won't say project, I don't know how intentional it was, but larger career characteristic of depicting women female characters who were not content with the status quo in society at the time the films were made, and frankly, certainly the status quo within Hollywood in many cases. So thank you very much, Marilyn, for that comment.
Do I have time for one more comment?
Is it about the film?
Yeah, it's about the film. Yeah,
go ahead.
It wasn't just women who were committed against their will. Men were committed too, usually, for reasons of inheritance. But I was told, I had a friend who had to put her son in a drug rehab, and she was told he had to be in by his 18th birthday because they weren't allowed to put him in against his will. And it seems that there was some fellow in the 60s and 70s that was put in some kind of a rehab or mental hospital against his will. And he went, after he got out, he went to most of the states, and he had most of the states change their laws to where you couldn't commit somebody against their will. Now, I don't know if it's true or not, but that's what I was told. That's why it's so universal. If somebody has heard differently, I'd like to know. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Marilyn. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. We went a little long, but we had a wide-ranging discussion and a number of interesting comments on a variety of topics related to or tethered to the film. We have a number of our remote classroom seminars coming up in the coming weeks. You can see them there on the screen. I would imagine that there's at least one of those that might appeal to many of you. As I said earlier, please visit brynmarfilm.org and to sign up for our emails so you can learn about what we have coming up in future weeks and about all the other great things we have, the new films we have available to stream, and the other education offerings we have. Finally, I would just say that, we definitely appreciate your support. I want to thank Lisa for joining us again tonight. As I mentioned, Lisa, like all of our co-moderators, gives her time and expertise, and I know that you all appreciate it. And along those lines, one of our fellow participants, Joss, wanted to say a word if he's still there. Joss?
I am here.
Please go ahead.
First of all, I thank you to Lisa for volunteering her time and expertise to this and several other of these sessions, of which there have been 30 since the spring. This has been an oasis of sanity and normalcy in our experience for the last 7 or 8 months. And great thanks to the Bryn Mawr Film Institute for doing this. Andrew, thank you for organizing this and for hosting this every week since then, and for recruiting your co-presenters for most of them. It has made a tremendous difference in everyone's day-to-day experience, week-to-week experience under very difficult circumstances. And with that in mind, I think we should make every effort to support the Bryn Mawr Film Institute for all of that. And it's really very easy to do. If when you register for this weekly event, or go to the Bryn Mawr Film Institute website, in the upper right-hand corner on virtually every page, there's a little button that says donate. And I would urge you to press that button and look at all the different ways that you can support the Bryn Mawr Film Institute. Just a general contribution, or a specific for a particular purpose, or by the privilege to name a seat in the theater. Whatever way you do it, this has been a tremendous, tremendous asset and a tremendous benefit for all of us over the last several months. I would urge you to go to their website or send a check and support the Bryn Mawr Film Institute to whatever extent you can. Thank you again.
Thank you, Joss. Thank you so much for that expression of support. And thanks to everybody who joins us week in and week out, because, you know, I can show up and Lisa can show up, but if none of you show up with interesting questions and neat ideas and related experiences to share that connect to the movie, then we don't have much of a discussion. I mean, I'd be very happy to talk to Lisa by myself for an hour, but she might get a little bored. So we're so glad you all come, and you obviously are a large part of what makes this discussion. And I'm sure you all join me in thanking Lisa for joining us tonight, as she so often has. Lisa, thank you so much.
It is my pleasure. I always get so much more out of my favorite films after discussing them with the Bryn Mawr Film Institute group. So I really appreciate, I get just as much out of this as you all do. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Lisa, and thank you all for joining us. And look for your Thursday email so you can find out what movie to watch this weekend, and join me a week from tonight to discuss another great movie. Take care, everybody. Thank you. Have a good night.